Yes, yes, church. Good morning. Take a seat. Sounds like you've been standing for a little while. Now you get to sit for even longer than you want to. Too bad. Here we are. I'm back, baby. No, I'm just kidding. It's good to be back with you guys. Ezra did me a solid and went 40 minutes last week, so I feel like we got carte blanche today. We can take what we need. It's good to be back with you. We are back in our study of Matthew. It ironically lines up with some things that are probably pressing on the hearts and minds of everyone in the room or anyone watching online. But I want to start this morning by apologizing. I asked you to volunteer to make baked goods for our guest bags and didn't tell you who to tell. O.R. Leslie is in charge of organizing that. Also, Regan and Wayne Walker do a great job with our guest ministry. If you would let them know if you're willing to do that, that would help us a ton, and we will get you in the rotation. Remember, no burnt offerings. We're good to go. Okay. I just want to start this morning by saying life is crazy. I say a lot of crazy things, but that might be the least controversial thing that I've said, the one that nobody here or who will ever listen will actually take issue with that. When you say to somebody, life is crazy, they will nod and they will say, you got that right, and they got something in their mind immediately that fits with that statement because it is. And there are probably some specific times in your life that you think about when you think about how life is crazy, where you've uttered those words or you've said them internally. And there might be some present specific events, probably fresh in your mind, that might come to you. But I'm really just talking about life in general for a few minutes, and then we'll get down to the specifics. Sometimes the craziest things in life, the most jarring things in life, the most memorable things in life are when two things get smashed together right in front of us. And what I mean by that is the moments where our memory of something or what we've created as our vision or our ideal of something and the way that we believe things are collide with the reality of about the way things actually are. And we're forced into that uncomfortable tension and that realization. I'm talking about those moments where our memory is put up against new information and we're forced to adopt new perspective, as painful as it may be. And it sounds complicated, but actually it's not. I just think it's like part of the experience of life. It happens all through our lives. It's definitely part of getting older. A lot of you have felt what I'm talking about right now many, many times. Some of the older men in the room have taken off to sprint after having been largely sedentary for probably a decade or so and found out that their hamstrings don't work the way that they used to. And they will never be the same. And who you thought you still were is not who you in fact are at this moment in time or will ever be again. And there are lots of moments where this happens. Everyone in the room, there's still some folks who probably aren't there, but pretty much everyone here has reached their full vertical potential, have you not? You're as tall as you're going to get. I'm sorry. All love to the short kings and queens out there, you guys. We still love you. But I want you to go back with me down memory lane for just a second. And since this is the second service, we have the time. I really want you to sit and marinate in this, right? Hey, y'all keep coming. So this is what we do. This is the extended director's cut. I want you to think about the first time you went back to your old elementary school. And before you even think about that moment, I want you to think about maybe when you were in your old elementary school, when you were actually a student. Can we go down memory lane for just a second? Remember whatever that was? Now, some of you were homeschooled. It was at the kitchen table. This might not quite fly. But most of us probably attended an elementary school or a primary school. And I want you to think about your morning routine. Waking up before there were smartphones, you read the comics or you read what was on the back of the cereal box and you collected box tops for education and sent in for a pair of flimsy sunglasses or something like that. You get off the bus with your backpack and your lunchbox that you were proud of, whatever your flavor was, some Power Rangers or something. Maybe it was Barbie, I don't know, My Little Pony, Polly Pockets, all those terrible little things. Opened it up when you got to lunch and there was a note from mom if she really loved you. My mom did. Everyone else, I'm sorry, my mom is better than yours. But she did put it on Miami Dolphins notepaper to try and woo me. She was really working on a different level there. But your Yoo-Hoo or your Capri Sun in there, I want you to think about the little ramps that were everywhere in your elementary school. I don't know how they discipline people in Texas, but in West Virginia, they did this thing where you had to flip your card where you got in trouble. I want you to remember what you felt when you had to go from red or from green to yellow to red. That's when you knew you were really in trouble and a note was getting sent home. I want you to think about recess. You remember recess when that was a thing? You used to have fun at recess. Before there was social media, the place where you showed off all of your new clothes for back to school shopping was at the pencil sharpener. Couldn't put it on the internet. And if you were by the electric pencil sharpener, you probably can still hear the sound and the way that it actually destroyed your pencils and probably the smell of it. And when you got the dust in your eye, we all remember all of that. I want you to remember learning. Do you guys remember actually learning things there? What about when you were reading out loud in class? The first time any of you realized that you had anxiety was that moment. When they started at the front of the class and everyone was going to read a couple sentences of whatever book it was, and you were sitting back there where Kyle is this morning, and he was thinking while Sebastian was reading up here, simultaneously laughing at Sebastian's mispronunciation and trying to figure out exactly what section he was going to have to read so he could read it like 20 times in advance, so when the class finally got to him, he could do it without messing it up and feeling dumb in front of everyone, and then you realize that you're having a panic attack for the very first time. You remember that? Yeah. Now I want you to remember the first time that you ever went back. I had a really interesting experience when I went back to my old elementary school. And if you've ever done this, you go back and you realize that when you walk in, it smells the same, it looks the same, everything is the same, but for some reason it's a little disorienting because though everything is the same, it's actually all different. And you walk the halls and you end up going back to your old classroom and you see these tiny miniature chairs made for ants and they're not like you remember. And if you're really brave and you've reached your vertical potential and your weight potential, you might feel like sitting in one of these just to remember what it was like. And now you got a whole different problem because you might not be able to stand up without being embarrassed about what's become of the cartilage in your knees. And you walk by those little water fountains that come up like shin high and you're like, I guess this whole building was just made for ants. This is very different than I remember it. It's the same, but everything's different because you're different. And you can't look at it the same that you did before. And maybe you never went back to your old elementary school, so I'm going to tell a second story, and this is just for your sheer enjoyment and to make fun of myself. Because one time I was back in my hometown as a full-grown adult, this was some years ago, and I was going down memory lane because I had moved away from home. And you know how whenever you go back home, you want to go to the places that you remember. There's a thing in humans where we want home. We are longing for the place that'll always be ours and never change. Like heaven is put into our hearts, but we try to find it in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., like Martinsburg, West Virginia. And I was there one day, and I drove by the old park my dad used to take me to, War Memorial Park. And when he didn't take me to the arcade on Thursdays, on the day he was off, we would go to the park, and we would have a blast out in the park. We'd play putt-putt, or we'd go to the playground. And I want to remind you that I am a whole-grown man by himself, stopping at War Memorial Park, a child's play area. Yeah, they're already like, what is this guy doing here? I can imagine what folks were thinking. But I am just overcome with nostalgia, and I passed the creepy little like spring seesaw animal things. I go past those, and I look at the big metal slide that looked way bigger when I was little than it looks now that I used to ride my bike down, which it's a wonder I'm still alive for many reasons. And literally it was metal. And that means when the sun hit it, it became like a frying pan. And I fried my hamstrings on that so many times. So I just acknowledged it, and I saw the prized jewel of my days in the playground. It's this thing that I don't even know if they make anymore. I haven't seen one, a merry-go-round. Do they still have merry-go-rounds? I think at some point we looked at that and we said, this is a bad idea. But this one still existed, and I went win the way back machine, and I thought of the times where Dad would just rev that thing up, and at that time, he was the strongest man in the universe, and he literally may have been at that time, I don't know. He was strong enough to send me careening into a spin of maniacal laughter and a blur that has not been replicated to this day, and I loved it. He would take a run and just let it go, and I remember him just hitting it, pung, 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 and I would go by, yeah, you guys have been there. And I got a really brave idea. I said, you know what? I'm going to take a spin on the old merry-go-round today. Oh yeah, grown man on a child's playground by himself at the merry-go-round, skateboarding it to get it started. And then, much to my pleasure, taking a running start to get it going, not tripping, not falling, not being caught like hanging on at its mercy, perfectly executed dismount from the ground into a perfect crisscross applesauce around a pole. And now I'm hanging on for dear life, and we have reached success. This is exactly like I remembered it for about 0.7 seconds. Because on the third revolution, it was not a sound of maniacal laughter at all. No, it was a different sound. Some of you have heard it before. It sounds like this. Everything that I had eaten from every meal of my entire life up to that point was now on the precipice of being ejected. And I was all alone. Once you're on a doom go round, there's no way out. You can't dive out without risking further injury. You just have to take it until it slows down. Grown man on the playground by himself now, had a terrible time. Anybody watching was probably having the time of their life. It was the same merry-go-round, the same paint, the same weird little metal studs that are even on this stage up here, the same technique, the same revolutions, the same speed, but everything was different. And I crawled off of that merry-go-round like I had just been dizzy-batted for way too many revolutions. Again, whole grown man crawling on a playground, now back to his car. Had to be hilarious. And I realized, everything is the same, but everything is different. You are not the same anymore. So I'm glad they took them off of playgrounds all over America, because you guys don't have to suffer the same humiliating defeat that I suffered that day when I realized that I'm just not built like that anymore. So this is a silly thing, but life has got a funny way of waking us up to uncomfortable realities. That was a very uncomfortable reality for me that day. And sometimes experiences like that humble us. And as funny as that story might be, I would say that we need experiences like that because it helps us gain perspective. After we experience something like that, we can never see the world or ourselves the same way again. And on a serious note, I think that it's likely that in the room today, in our minds, in our hearts today, that the current situation in our country is one of those moments that has that kind of potential, where people will never see things the same ever again and may not see themselves the same ever again. And I would say that it's probably likely that it already is that kind of moment. And we're talking about it today because I don't think there's a way to escape it and be reasonable. I don't think there's any benefit from ignoring it. I don't think there's anything good or a blessing to us to come through these doors, lift our voices in praise, and then walk right back out and take up all of the anxiety and all of the tension and all of the angst that everyone is feeling. So right now, there are a couple questions that are being asked just in the world at large around us and within this very room that I think are valid. You might be asking, and you've certainly heard people asking, what has happened to us? Like, is this what we've really become? Is this where we are as a society? And you might have heard someone say, when will we get things back to normal? Can we get back to the America that was? Can we get back to what I remember? Can we get back to the way things were? What happened to the people that I knew, the culture that I knew, the people that I loved, the land that I loved? What happened to the America that I once knew? And let me be the first to say that part of me doesn't look forward to what may be coming in the days that are ahead of us. But there's another part of me that is sitting in the scripture and thinking, actually, I'm looking forward to getting to whatever it is that God wants to do. And if I'm being honest, I feel as though we have to reevaluate sometimes what we're so desperate to get back to, because what it looks like to move forward might look the same, but it might actually be very, very different. And here's what I mean. When the dust settles and it all comes home of everything that's happened over the last few weeks, despite what you've heard, it's not going to be a first for God's people. It might be the first in our lifetimes, but it's not the first for the people of God. I caution you to reject the temptation to believe that things like you have seen over the last few weeks have never happened before, because they have. And they've even happened here. Reject the idea that the church is in new unknown territory where we have to fend for ourselves in ways that God has not called us to, because we're not in unknown territory. We're in unfamiliar territory for those of us who haven't been alive long enough to see these sorts of things happen. And there's a lot of rhetoric that's claiming that we are seeing a great turning point in history. And I want to challenge that idea this morning, but not in the way that you might assume. I want to suggest instead that what we're feeling right now is instead and must be a turning point for me and you, us individually and us collectively as a church, because there are always two choices in front of us in moments like this. Either we can choose to keep pressing in the same direction that got us here, or we could allow the discomfort of the current moment to rouse us from our comfortable slumber and take us into a new direction. So I think we are, in many ways, at a turning point, but it's not a turning point in the way that the loudest voices in our culture are screaming to anyone that will give them clicks and attention and money. On the other side of our current moment, many things are going to look the same, but everything might be different in some ways. And I just would suggest to you, maybe controversially, that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because God's people have been in situations like this before. I'm going to go to maybe an unexpected place to work through this a little bit, and then we're going to come back to our original text in the Gospel of Matthew, because it ironically and interestingly lines up perfectly for what I hope that we need to hear and can receive this morning. There's a section in the Old Testament in a few books called Haggai, Ezra, and Nehemiah that don't get a lot of attention, but the thing that they're famous for is the rebuilding of the wall, and we find that wall of Jerusalem being rebuilt in the prophet of Nehemiah. But there's actually a lot going on in those books that pertains to our situation and any situation that's filled with tension like we are today. These books, all of them happen in the Second Temple period, the time between the Testaments. It goes all the way through 70 AD when Rome would come and destroy Jerusalem and the temple that Jesus was prophesying in Matthew chapter 24. And these books record the transition period when the Jews and the children of Israel came out of Babylonian captivity and all the challenges that they were facing when they were trying to get things back to the way that they were before. Now, just envision this with me for a moment. I know that you've never seen the people of God be obsessed with trying to get things the back they were before. Have you? No? Just me? I feel like we do that quite a lot. Now, in 538 BC, Persian King Cyrus released the Jewish exiles to go home and rebuild the temple. That account is found in the book of Ezra, the first chapter, verses 1 through 11. And about 50,000 of the children of Israel go back. Two years later, the prophet Haggai speaks by the Lord and tells them to start rebuilding the temple because they'd been sitting on their hands and not doing what they were sent to go back to do. That's a whole nother lesson for another time. But in Ezra chapter 3, verse 8, they finished the foundation of the new temple. And that brings us to the situation that I think we have something in common with, and we will inevitably have in common with every time in the future that we come into trying times. This people have returned from displacement and captivity in Babylon, and they get finished reconstructing the foundation of the temple of God in Jerusalem that had been destroyed. They get to go back to the house of God. They get to assemble together for the first time since it was taken away from them. It would have been like a more extreme version of when COVID locked down the country and told people not to come together to worship. And if all of the church buildings had actually been destroyed, and then years later we all got to come back and worship for the first time, this is what they were experiencing. What a moment it would have been. Because for 70 years, there had been a longing and a wishing for them to get back to being the people of God, to being able to worship freely again, to be able to do what they had been called to do. And we would expect to find the children of God now, after so many great acts of favor and Cyrus releasing them, to be in such a state of jubilation that nothing could dampen their spirits. But what actually happens in Ezra chapter 3, verses 8 through 13 is really interesting. Here's what it says. It says, all the people shouted with a great shout, and they praised the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. Good start. But in verse 12, many of the priests and the Levites and the heads of fathers of houses and old men who had seen the first house. Before I continue, the priests and the Levites in those days were the spiritual leaders of the entire culture. They were the people who were connected to God, knew God, spoke for God, and brokered the relationship between God and the people at large. In case you are not following me, that is a Christian's job today. For we are a royal priesthood. We are the modern Levites. This is the place we sit in our culture. These people, it says in verse 12, when they saw the foundation laid, wept with a loud voice. They saw the first house and remembered what it was like. And when the foundation had been laid on the rebuilt temple, they could not get out of their minds what they remembered. And they, instead of rejoicing, instead of praising, they wept aloud. Verse 13 is telling. It says, they wept so that people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. Their weeping and their outcry was so loud that they could not tell the difference between praise and the shouts of pain and anguish that were coming from the leaders of the people. And not only that, it was so loud that it was heard from all of the people around. So as we break down this scene, this is the critical thing that we understand when we're in times of unrest and that we have to pay attention to. We find that there are people who are overcome with joy and praise, and they rejoice. But what else is going on here is that there are people that look at the new foundation, and they were overcome with sorrow because they compared it to the first temple. And by comparison, they felt this new iteration was worthless. And they were so upset by comparison about how things used to be in their view and how they are now. Their wailing was so great that it made the sounds of joy and praise indistinguishable, that people from afar heard it. People were so upset about things not being the way they remembered that their cries outweighed the praise that God was due. How sad is that situation? These well-meaning Jews, Levites, and even elders returned to a familiar place, and they could not reconcile the fact in their heart that it was the same, but everything was different. And the question that I would ask is, I wonder how that felt to the people there who were praising, who didn't see the first temple. How did that impact the people who were in the land now, who moved there after the children of Israel were exiled, and they are now being exposed to the community of God for the first time? They are being exposed to the people of God for the first time, the worship of God for the first time, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for the first time. And what they are met with is this kind of witness. Here's why this matters and connects in a way that might surprise you. Despite the tragic and traumatic events of the past few weeks in this country, I find it important to remind you that something unbelievable that you have prayed for a very long time is happening at the very same time. In some cases, it's even a direct result of this present unrest that we're dealing with right now. Did you know that people en masse are coming back to church? Did you know that statistics have shown, and the data shows that as of 2025, compared to 2020, there are 30 million more people in this country that are interested in having an open conversation about God and the gospel. 30 million more people are open to having this conversation than there were 5 years ago. Did you know that the data that was just reaffirmed this past week says that despite the cynical belief of some folks that have been in church for a long time, the generations that have been written off in this country, Gen Z and millennials, are now the largest church-going demographic in the country? There are more Gen Zers attending church than even boomers and Gen Xers. Did you know that that's what's happening right now? Did you know that there's that kind of a hunger and a desire? Did you know that one of the under-recognized responses to the tragic events of the past few weeks is that people who previously thought they had no use for God have seen the world and this culture in its current state and have decided that they need to find God, and they need to get their family into church, and they need to do whatever they can to choose a different path than the one they see that everyone is on. That is all true. And you might say, I don't understand why that would be the case. And I would just say, people never realize how much they actually love air until they're underwater and don't have any. And what happens when things get really bad, especially really shocking, is that we realize how much we are dying and gasping for air. We realize how far underwater we've actually come. So we as the church, the elders now, the priesthood now, are pilgrims, sojourners, and spiritual immigrants. And I know that we have a deep nostalgia and great expectations for the things as we remember them, both in a spiritual way, in a church way, but also in a cultural way. We long with exuberance for the hopeful memories of God and country, and when those two ideals were paramount to each man, woman, and child, and when the dialogue of openness was a virtue and free speech, or all speech, was an unassailable value of our society, we look back to those and we're tempted to yearn for the things to be as we knew them, and we want it to be just like we were told everything was in our history books, whether that was true or not. We just want it to be like we remember. This is too uncomfortable and too discouraging. Wouldn't that be great? But when life gets crazy, we're forced to realize that some people aren't who we expected them to be, and that things often aren't what we thought they were. And that in this case, we as a people aren't who we thought we were. Or at least we might not be anymore. And frankly, that sows the seeds of wondering if we ever actually were. I'll share a personal moment with you that I experienced earlier this year. We took Mom for her birthday to New York City. Maggie and I took her up. She had never been. And one of the things that she wanted to see was the 9/11 memorial. Incredible place. I would encourage you to spend some time there in thought and prayer if you're ever there. And it's not the first time I had been to a 9/11 memorial. I used to do some work at the Pentagon, so I've been around those things before. But I tell you, what really struck me this time was an internal conflict and tension that I never felt before. It's a somber place. It was a place for the first time where I was having to reconcile everything that happened back on that day that I remember like it was yesterday. I mean, that moment for millions of Americans is like the JFK assassination years before, where you know exactly where you were and what happened and how things changed after that. I remember seeing the planes hit the buildings. I remember what class I was in, who the teacher was who was sitting beside me. I remember the fear. I remember the anxiety that America could actually be under attack. It was something that we never experienced before. No one had ever touched us, especially not like that. And I remember what happened immediately after and being so encouraged that for the first time, everybody was on the same team for a little while. I remember that we were united and people flocked back to churches. They were searching for answers to figure out what was going on. And even if you didn't like country music, you were singing Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. And rest in peace, Toby Keith, you had us all going for a little bit. But I was standing there at the memorial and I was struck with this cognitive dissonance and this tension that everything that has happened after that has made me question if this country actually is what I thought it was. Because after 9/11, things changed a lot. We lost personal freedoms for the sake of security. I'm not making a political commentary on whether that was the right or wrong decision. I'm just saying these are things that happened. And then we come to find out as the years go by that the intelligence communities knew something was going to happen and they just ignored it. And so this probably could have been avoided. And there were full class action lawsuits against the government. And we went to go fight the guy who was supposedly responsible and later found out there never were weapons of mass destruction there. And then we were in a whole other conflict with another guy in a cave in Afghanistan who was mad at us from the first time we were in Afghanistan and pulled out without helping the people. And now we've got this years-long holy war that they've declared on us. And all of these things come into view after. And for the first time, I was confronting the tension of realizing that the America that I thought was and the people who I thought we were, at least at the highest structural governmental levels, were not exactly as I had been told. And that we didn't always get it right. And that we've made terrible mistakes. And sometimes people have acted not in the interest of other people's best interest. And the reason why I had tension was even though I knew that, I'm looking at the names of the people that died in those towers and the first responders that died as heroes. And the people that died in planes that went down in Pennsylvania to make sure that other buildings weren't hit and more lives weren't lost. And I realized that even though at the highest levels, our society and our culture and our country is not what I thought it was, the people underneath all of that actually do embody the heroicism that we were told we were. That those people are heroes, that they do deserve to be venerated, they do deserve to be respected, that we should hold them in high regard. They represent the best of us, and anyone who has given their life for their fellow man represents the best of us. But for the first time, I was in that tension point where the world that I thought was, and the America that I thought was, I was confronted with something that was telling a different story. What occurs to me is that everything was the same, and at the same time, everything was different. And the church is not immune to this. We experience these moments where we're forced to reconcile the view of our rose-tinted glasses with the reality that is before us, and we struggle in these tension points. We realize that at a high level, people are not what we thought they were, but somehow deeper on an individual level, somehow still people are real embodiments of the ideal. That even though I could be upset about the way things have been handled at a high institutional level, that every single person is still made in the image of God. And that even among my neighbors, even those with whom I disagree fiercely, there are still heroes. And even though the powers that be and the structures that constrain and categorize us, they don't define us or the content of our character. And that therein lies the great danger of moments like this. Because make no mistake, these things have happened in a way over the last few weeks that are tragic atrocities. But there's something even more heinous that I've seen. And that's the way that we have collectively responded to them. Before any facts were known about what happened over the last few weeks, definitive assertions and accusations of guilt and motive were made in a hurricane of, vitriol. Almost immediately, voices from one loud minority on one end of the spectrum celebrated and gloated over the tragic loss of life of an innocent man. And on the other end, a just as loud minority began calling for open war on their fellow man in hatred of the other. And all of this was before any details were even known. And this should teach us that the venom and rhetoric that we saw immediately after those events was not actually the result of the events that had occurred, but instead, they just became the outlet for the attitudes of bitterness, hatred, ugliness, and sin that was already present in our collective consciousness. There were some voices of reason trying to be peacemakers, and I'm convinced that represents the vast majority of Americans, but because we're all a slave to our algorithms that reward outrage, their wise calls for de-escalation were drowned out by viral videos of commentators and pundits fomenting additional outrage and calling for an acceleration in hostility against ourselves. These pundits who hold so much power, drunk off clicks and the almighty dollar, immediately politicized the death of an innocent woman on a train and a man on a college campus to score political points and profit off of their blood, and it is despicable. And we, the people, inebriated with the wine of our political idols, added our voices to the outcry because millions of people shared videos and posts and memes without 1 ounce of credibility. Quotes were pulled out of context, altered, removed from their context, and they were used to either villainize or canonize figures to advance a political ideology or to justify our idolatry. Only to see over the following days that everyone was wrong. They were all wrong about who and what and why these things had happened. Everyone was out on the internet calling for the heads of people they had never met. When, as it turned out, ironically, it was in the dark recesses of that same internet that formed the weapon that would be used to exhume all of our great disdain for each other in public view for us all to see and wrestle with. And so it created a moment for us, much like 9/11, where we've been forced to reconcile the world that we thought was with the world that we actually live in. But unlike 9/11, when we were united against a common enemy, this time we have felt the disunity and the discomfort of a people who have been told that the enemy is actually us. It would appear that the church is not immune because as the dust has settled, we saw people say that they would choose to stay or leave their church based on whether their pet theory was attached to a sermon on a Sunday. We here at Leander were spared because I was out of town and Ezra ran the play that was planned from before anything happened. So nobody got to make that call here. Thank God for that. But I even saw ministers who were at the throats of other ministers telling them, look, if your preacher doesn't preach on this on Sunday, it's time for you to find a new church. As well as other ministers calling them out and saying, we shouldn't talk about current events at all. But in every case, the people of God became caught in the crossfire and the hurricane of emotion and fear with seemingly no outlet but to take up the same attitude, weapons, aggression that the world has offered as a solution. And just like that, in the presence of God and in the assembly of the saints and in view of those who are coming to God for the first time in record numbers because of this present distress, a cry has gone up from church buildings across this country with the voices of people who are supposed to represent God, and it has not been what it ought to have been. It should have been one of paradoxical mourning and praise. But instead, it's been mingled with something unexpected and unfit for the kingdom of heaven. It's been polluted by something all too familiar to the world around us, the sound of sorrow, comparisons, bitterness, preference-driven disgust, disdain, fear, aggression, war, and retaliation. A cry that should have been one of praise mingled with grief to offer a stark distinction to the world around us instead became a cry identical to the very ones whose God is not the God we serve, whose God is their belly. And I ask the same question I would have asked at the foundation of the Second Temple. What effect does it have to hear and see this on people who are coming to seek God for the first time? Let it be known that if you show up here on Sunday for the first time, that is not what you are going to get. That's not who this family is, and it is not what we stand for. What effect does it have on the person who decided to come back to church after a long absence? Maybe they now remember why they left in the first place. And what does it say about a God who's been moving surgically throughout time to call his people, us, out of idolatry and back to the heart of worship, discipleship, and community, who has exercised so much care and dispensed so much favor on us to bring us out of this long and comfortable sleep to an uncomfortable moment? God gives us the answer. In Haggai, he says this, "Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? Yet now," he says, "be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord." Please internalize that if you internalize nothing else. Be strong, all you people of the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. According to the covenant I made with you when you came out of Egypt, my spirit remains in your midst. Fear not. Is the Spirit of God in this house this morning? We ought to fear not. I don't know how you listen to those voices raising the greatest commands and not feel and know that the Spirit is here right now. So we ought to be strong. We ought not to have fear. God says he will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations so that the treasures of all the nations shall come in, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord of hosts. He says this, remember, the silver is mine, the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. It all belongs to him. And the latter glory of this house will be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place, I will give peace. God says to those of us who have such fond memories of what was before, your job is to be strong and to remember that he is with us and to remember that everything belongs to him, that ultimately all nations come to the Lord, and that the latter glory, no matter what it looks like and if it's different than what you saw before, will be greater than the former, that he alone will give us peace. And so God's answer is to take heart. He knows even now what we're going to be tempted by, to remember and be disappointed by. He knows what you're afraid of right now. First, recognize that God acknowledges that sometimes things happen where things will not be the same after. He says, yes, the nations will shake. And our nation is shaking right now, but you are part of an unshakable kingdom, church. It's wise for us to consider that God might not even want things to be the same as they were before. Gen Z and young Americans are flocking back to churches even amidst this present political tension. And it's so because, as is the case so many times during distress and conflict, when you remove a tranquilizing agent of comfort, it opens us up to be willing to consider new considerations and convictions. Sometimes the ugliest atrocities are the things that God inexplicably works for his good and for his purpose. You know, I quote C.S. Lewis a lot. We're going to do it again today. This is the Screw Tape Letters. If you haven't read this book, I humbly suggest that you read it. I'll give you a little bit of background so you understand what I'm about to share with you. This book, Lewis puts himself in the position of a tempter, a demon who's sent to take away one of God's children. And it's written in the fashion of a correspondence between an older demon and a younger demon. And the older demon is teaching the younger demon how to make sure his mark or his human that he's responsible for doesn't serve God and ultimately doesn't make it into the kingdom. And in the fifth letter, he has something interesting to say about times where violence erupts and war happens. This book was written in response to what was happening around the time of World War II, one of the most ugly periods in the history of the world. And here's what he has to say about things like war and senseless violence. He says, "Of course, war is entertaining. The immediate fear and suffering of the humans is a legitimate and pleasing refreshment for our myriads of toiling workers," speaking of his fellow demons. "But what permanent good does it do unless we make use for bringing our souls to our Father below? That's the devil. When I see the temporal sufferings of humans who finally escape us, I feel as if I had been allowed to taste the first course of a rich banquet and then denied the rest. It is worse than not to have tasted it at all. The enemy," he's speaking of God, "true to his barbarous methods of warfare, allows us to see the short misery of his favorites, only to tantalize and torment us and mock our incessant hunger, which during this present phase of the great conflict, his blockade has admittedly imposed. Let us therefore think rather how to use than how to enjoy this European war. For," here's the important part, It has certain tendencies inherent in it, which are in themselves by no means in our favor. You might ask, how could war not be in favor of Satan, the devil, and our enemies? He says, they are not in our favor. We may hope for a good deal of cruelty and unchastity, but if we are not careful, we shall see thousands turning in this tribulation to the enemy, while tens of thousands who do not go so far as that will nevertheless have their attention diverted from themselves to values and causes which they believe to be higher than themselves. I know the enemy disapproves even of many of their causes, but that's where he's so unfair. He often makes prizes of humans who have given their lives for causes he thinks bad on the monstrously sophistical ground that humans thought them good and were following them the best they knew. What Lewis is saying is that there's a paradox in play anytime things get really ugly in life around us. Because in war, when people know that their fear is real and the chance that they might be taken from this life is real, they're all the more likely to find God. Hence the saying, there's never an atheist in a foxhole. And the paradox at play here is now that our reeling, divided American fabric for the first time in a very long time has been forced out of its comfort. We've been forced out of our lie, out of the mirage, out of the facade. We're forced to deal with how barbaric we can actually be. Things that don't happen here and only happen in other places evidently do happen here. We have to admit how much we actually distrust each other and how much we actually can hate each other. And that makes all of our fears real. And that is an environment in which God gets some of his best work done. When people wake up and are no longer drunk with their comfort, no longer tranquilized by apathy, when things get real, God is closer than ever. That's why God promises that despite what things may look like, and despite them not being as you remember them, the latter in his hands will be greater than the former. And maybe I have a scandalous suggestion for you this morning, church. Maybe God doesn't want the American church to get back to its normal, apathetic, comatosely comforted habits. God will dispense peace, but that doesn't mean he wants his church to go back to the same bickering and jockeying. I don't think God's interested in our unspoken competitive spirit that all churches have with each other. He says we must remember that he is with us however it looks, whoever is there, whatever things are now part of the norm, whatever old things aren't like they used to be. The important thing that is he is with us, and the question you have to ask yourself is your faith in what you remember about this country, or is your faith in Jesus Christ? What's curious to me about this, if you'll hang with me just a little while longer, when we look at the children of Israel and the account that we talked about before, their memories in human nature don't seem to recall just how broken things were in the temple and the society that they were remembering. They were longing for the temple that they remembered, but they didn't remember what had actually happened that led to them being taken into captivity. Things were not amazing. Despite the beauty of the first temple, the glory of God had left because things were so bad. God had called their worship useless and he detested it. And the people were mourning when they should have been praising, and what they wanted to bring back wasn't what God wanted to bring back. So before we fall into the same trap, might we consider that God doesn't want to bring back what we want to bring back? Maybe God really just wants us. So I would say this is a turning point indeed. We're going to have to decide, each and every one of us, whether we'll continue in the direction that has actually brought us here. The church will have to continue whether we want to continue to place our hopes and our comfort in the kingdoms of this world and in the hatred of people that we don't even know. Or will we look around and recognize that this is the same place we've always been, but somehow everything is different. And since everything is different, we see things differently, and that allows us to choose something different too. Collectively, as a church and a family, we have this choice to make, and I hope we can overcome this jarring sense that emerges when our experiences don't mesh with our memories. I hope that there is a noise that rises up from this place, but that it's a noise that is distinguishable from the world around us. That it is not the same kind of mourning, the same kind of grief. That it is a sound of praise, a sound that leaves no doubt. I hope that we will choose to praise him like we've never praised him before, that we'll choose to love each other like we've never loved each other before, that we will choose to be what we've never been before. I hope that we are the same, but in every way different. And despite the trauma and despite the bloodletting, as Lewis prophetically predicted, there is somehow a resurgence in the seeking of God. And in this moment, people who've had their world shaken are looking for something unshakable. And we have to remember that when people are hurting, the message of the gospel is all the stronger. People who were never willing to have a conversation with you about spiritual things are now going to be willing to have a conversation with you about spiritual things. People that you never influenced before by your conduct and your character and the fruit in your life are going to be influenced by the conduct and character and the fruit in your life. But when they show up here on a Sunday, or when they show up next to you at work, and when they come across your online profiles that the algorithm throws their way, are they going to find a peacemaker? Are they going to find the inexplicable fruit of the Spirit? These people in a world fueled by rage, will they find love when they come across your path? In a world saturated with unending anxiety, will they encounter the peace that passes understanding? In a world whose currency is despair, will they find an inexplicable joy in your heart? In a world that tells them that retaliation of evil is the only way forward, will they find goodness? A world that preaches that the time for restraint is over, will they find in you self-control? Will they find in you a person that believed when Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers"? When they come to us, will they find the same level of animosity, strife, and anxiety, or will they instead find the fruit of the Spirit, a kingdom that is not of this world and a kingdom that is not subject to the shaking? Comfort is an idol that is only revealed when it is removed. And when our comfort is removed, will we be just as distressed as those who don't know Jesus at all? If we are, it reveals that we claim to put our hope in Christ, but we actually put our hope in the same things they do. And I want to remind you this morning, Christian, that you've been given a hope that is not dependent on your circumstances. You've been given a hope that does not fade or fracture. You've been given a hope that cannot be taken away by any worldly power or evil that exists. And we must make sure that individually and collectively, that is the witness that we are giving to the world. That must be the message of the church at large in this moment. When people walk in these doors, do they see people who look the same as them, but are made of something entirely different? Can we go full circle really quick, guys? We'll close this down here. You have been sitting a long time. I admit you have. We'll stand you up in a minute. But we started this in Galilee, and then we went all the way to the Old Testament, and we spent time back in our history and present events. How do we even get back to here today? I want you to look at the scripture that we're calling from here in Matthew chapter 28. It says, after the Sabbath, after Jesus' crucifixion that we read earlier, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, and the angel of the Lord descended from heaven. And he came and he rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. And for fear, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid." Recurring theme that keeps coming up in every scripture today. "For I know you seek Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, he is risen." And he said, "Come see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee, just like he promised. And there you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and they ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." Man, imagine that was what Jesus said to you after all of this, after what you had just witnessed. What if he just showed up to you today and said, "Greetings"? You'd be like, "Geez, that's a weird first word, but okay. I'm happy to see you." They came and took hold of his feet and they worshiped him. And he said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." Jesus tells them through the Marys that he is going before them to Galilee and that they will meet him there. This is right after the resurrection, and it is before any of them understand the full extent of what God has been up to or is about to do. Now, mind you, for the last 72 hours, the disciples have had their entire understanding of the world upended. They had their prior beliefs about who they were and who they were following and what he was going to do violently torn away from them. They witnessed the most barbaric of events. They saw what we read today: their brother, their friend, their rabbi, falsely accused, spit upon, beaten, stripped naked, mocked, had the vast majority of his skin ripped from his body, had railroad-sized spikes driven through him, being offered gall on used Roman toilet paper to drink. They saw the man who represented their entire worldview, who held all of their hopes, brutally disfigured and maimed and murdered in front of a public audience. Everything that they thought they knew about the world was upended. Everything they thought they knew about the kingdom of heaven was torn asunder in the last 72 hours. Everything they believed about themselves was now in doubt as their teacher was executed as a public enemy of state. And in their heads, they know their association with Jesus makes them an enemy of state too. And they might have even thought something that people have been thinking this week: I bet they want us all dead. So in fear, they cower together, not knowing what's going to happen or where to go from there until the women come declaring that the tomb is empty and that Jesus was going to meet them in Galilee. And they had to be like, excuse me, come again? He's what? And then, inexplicably, he was. He was there with them. They thought he was a ghost, but he wasn't. He ate with them. He beheld them. They touched him. He really was really there, really risen. What could their minds have done with this? It must have felt like the craziest fever dream of all time, with each one asking themselves, I think I'm seeing things, until they realize everyone else is seeing things too. It's real. This actually happened. We saw him die. We saw him rolled behind the stone, and yet here he is. Just for a second, think about how everything they knew about what was possible, what reality really was, who Jesus really was, has all been changed in an instant. And what had to be just a disorienting combination of joy and confusion and even fear, they set off and they make for Galilee. They go back home. And here is where I think their experience lines up with ours. Because their trip back to Galilee would have been a lot like your trip back to your old elementary classroom, just on a much greater and more important scale. Here's why. Everywhere they passed on the trip, they have seen before with totally different eyes. Everywhere they passed on the trip, they're seeing again, but in a way they've never seen it before. Everywhere they go and everything they see and everything they remember, they would have thought it's the same, but now everything is different. I can't see anything the same anymore. I can't feel with the same heart. I can't reason with the same mind. Everywhere they went, they would have had to re-examine a totally different understanding of their life, a different understanding of the God they served, their people and their country, what it all meant, their experiences that they had there. For the first time they were there, it was they had the understanding that they were following a Messiah that was going to upend the physical Roman kingdom and usher in a physical kingdom of Israel again. But now it's been revealed that they have always been a part of something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. As they walked by the pool where Jesus healed the lame, who were probably still hanging out there, they would have walked by where Jesus healed 10 lepers and only one came back, seeing it with totally different eyes. The villages where Jesus had healed children who were still alive, who recognized them, where he healed the blind who could see them and knew who they were. They would come out and it would be a totally different experience. They would walk by the fields where Jesus healed the 5,000 and the 4,000. They would look across the shore and remember when Legion came out and we didn't understand what he was doing. They would look and see all of these things in a totally different perspective than they ever had before. They would walk by the sea and remember when they almost died there and they couldn't figure out why Jesus couldn't be bothered at all. He was literally just napping through the storm. Or when one time Jesus just walked out on the middle of the sea and couldn't be more comfortable. Every single experience and memory they had would have come flooding back on this trip back to Galilee. But there's no way they could have seen it or thought about it the same way they had before. The places were the same. The people were the same. But on this side of the resurrection, everything was different. So in a sense, what I'm saying to you in conclusion this morning is this. No matter what is going on around us, we all as Christians are living on the other side of the resurrection. And that means that our lives are a continuation of the disciples' experience in going back to Galilee. It means that if you have been a partaker in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, nothing should ever look the same. We don't see as we saw before. We've been transformed by the renewing of our mind, and we do this daily. We don't see the events that happen in the world the way that the world sees them because we're not the same people that we were before. Things have a totally different meaning now. There's a different heart and motivation to our behaviors. We know there was and is a greater purpose even when we're in exile, a greater purpose when we experience pain, a greater purpose for our experiences, no matter how uncomfortable. And when we come together as a church to worship, this must always be the tie that binds. It's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is not our politics, it is not our enemies, and it is certainly not our fears and our anxieties. It is the reality that happened at a moment in time where they put Christ in the earth, and 3 days later he got up, and since then everything else has been different. We're going to leave this church building and go back into the familiar yet unfamiliar world that is out there. You might want things to be remembered like when things were simpler and slower and easier and there was less anger and less strife, but in view of the resurrection, in the view of what God is wanting to do now, they might be very different. And even if they're very different, Jesus is still King, and the latter is greater than the former. The resurrection means that we should always be in a time of praise, a time of overwhelming joy. Whatever the days ahead hold, we would welcome all of those who come into fellowship, new and old. Let it be a time where we lay down the petty arguments that divided us before, a time where we end the comparison to what was, and let it be a time of trust in the Lord and rejoicing of what God has said he will do, because your God has never broken a promise. These major events will be a turning point for us, or they will be a thing that reinforces the already cancerous convictions in the world around us, push us further down that road. I would never equivocate the life or death of any person with the death of Jesus Christ, as some blasphemously have over the last few weeks. But I do say that I see an equivocation in the kind of society we read about in Scripture. It's the same kind that we're living in now. Because underneath of all the outrage and the vitriol, what fuels the maddening misuse of quotes in context, the demons beneath the crisis of gender and identity, the fuel for the divisive political machine that's worn us all so thin that we could be at each other's throats, the question that our world is ill-equipped to answer is this right here. It's the same question that was on the lips of Pontius Pilate. What is truth? I want you to remember, Christian, that when God answered that question, he did not give us a politic, he did not give us an enemy to fight, he did not give us a party line. When God wanted to answer the question, what is truth, he gave us a person. And so before you swallow the stream of continuous divisiveness that comes to us, before you internalize it, before you allow it to radicalize you like the world around us, remember that because that person got up from the grave and went ahead of you to Galilee and is seated at the right hand of the Father, you do not have to see this world the way the world tells you you have to see it. Church, this week spend more time with the person God gave us than with your algorithm or the political news. Spend more time with the actual people you can see, touch, and love than news bites of political propaganda. I humbly suggest it's time for us to unplug from the matrix and plug back into the person that God has given us. Above all, even though it might look the same and everything might somehow be different, take heart in the truth of Jesus Christ, because no matter what rages around us, in the end, better is always on this side of the resurrection. And because he rose, you can put your trust in him. All else is sinking sand. All else is shaking. But this truth, this person, Jesus Christ, is the unshakable, ironclad, immovable foundation of our lives. If you need prayer this morning, there's a lot of anxiety out there, I know. I would love to sit with you and be those people that we're called to be. If you've never put your trust in Jesus, I would say that what has happened recently is the greatest proof that you need to. There's no better place for you to put it. And we would love to receive you and help you take a step towards Jesus today. And when we stand and sing, church, do me a solid. I know Ray is going to bring it. He always does. But let the sound that goes up from this place be a distinguishable sound from all the world around us. A sound of praise, a sound of love, and a sound of victory. That's what we have in him.